One author and era. Karl Marx, 1818–1883, was born in Trier to a liberal Jewish family. His father converted to Lutheranism for professional reasons. Studied philosophy in Berlin, where he was profoundly shaped by Hegel and then by the young Hegelian's materialist critiques, and spent most of his adult life in London, in poverty, researching and writing in the British Museum. He lived through industrialization's most brutal phase, the factory system, child labor, 14-hour workdays, mass urban poverty amid accumulating wealth. He was the most consequential social theorist of the modern period, not because he was always right, but because he asked the question that nobody in the tradition of liberal political economy had asked. What if the very mechanism that produces modern wealth also systematically produces modern poverty, not as an accident or dysfunction, but as a structural necessity? 2. The book's genesis. Does Capital, Critic der politischen Ökonomie Kapital, Critique of Political Economy, Vol. 1, 1867, was 20 years in gestation. Marx had been working on economic manuscripts since the 1840s, producing the Economic and Philosophically manuscripts, 1844, the Grundrisse, 1857–58, and a draft before the published Capital. It was written as a critique, not merely a description. Marx accepted the categories of classical political economy, Smith, Ricardo, and argued that, consistently applied, they revealed the contradictions and exploitative foundations of capitalism. Without Capital, the critique of capitalism on internal economic grounds, as opposed to moral denunciation, would lack its most rigorous formulation. 3 main THMES. The labor theory of value and surplus value. Where does profit come from? Marx argues, developing Ricardo, that the value of commodities is determined by the socially necessary labor time required to produce them. Workers produce more value than they are paid for. The surplus is appropriated by capital owners as profit. This is not theft in the legal sense, but the structural mechanism of capitalist exploitation. Alienation. What does wage labor do to the worker? The worker who sells their labor produces commodities that confront them as alien things. The product of their activity does not belong to them, enriches others, and impoverishes them. Labor becomes not the expression of the worker's humanity, but its negation. The commodity fetish. What is ideological about how capitalism presents itself? In capitalist society, social relations between people appear as relations between things, commodities, money, capital. The economic categories that structure our lives, wage, price, profit, feel natural and objective when they are in fact historically specific social relations disguised as properties of things. The tendency toward concentration and crisis. What is capitalism's internal dynamic? Competition drives individual capitalists to accumulate, invest, and replace labor with machinery. But this reduces the source of surplus value, living labor, and produces tendencies toward crisis, overproduction, falling rate of profit, and periodic collapse. 4. Summary. Capital Vol. 1 opens with the analysis of the commodity, the elementary form of capitalist wealth. Every commodity has a use value, what it is good for, and an exchange value, what it trades for. The puzzle. What makes qualitatively different commodities commensurable in exchange? Marx's answer. They share a common substance, abstract human labor, measured in time. This analysis produces the labor theory of value. But how then does profit arise? Capital buys labor power, the worker's capacity to work at its value, the cost of reproducing the worker. But labor power, when exercised, creates more value than it costs. This excess, surplus value is the source of profit. Exploitation is structural, not incidental. The pivotal chapter on the commodity fetish shows that this exploitation is systematically concealed. In the market, The exchange appears as a transaction between equals. The worker freely sells their labor. The coercion is invisible because it operates at the structural level. The worker owns nothing but their labor power, rather than through direct compulsion. The text develops through analyses of the working day, the struggle over how many hours of surplus labor can be extracted, machinery and large-scale industry, capital's substitution of dead labor for living, which produces the reserve army of unemployed, and the historical process of primitive accumulation, the violence through which land, commons, and subsistence were seized from workers to create the landless proletariat. 5. Deep dive analysis. The concept of the commodity fetish, fetishism, is Marx's most philosophically original contribution and the key to understanding capital as a work of both economics and social philosophy. The argument: in capitalist society, the social relations between producers, the human relationships of labor, cooperation, and exchange, appear not as what they are but as properties of things. Consider, when the price of wheat rises, this appears as something that happens to wheat, as if wheat has the power to be worth more or less. But in reality, price is a social relation. It reflects the collectively determined exchange ratios of a market economy, which are themselves products of specific social arrangements, private property, wage labor competition. What is actually a relation between people, producers, consumers, owners, appears as a relation between things, commodities. This is not simply error or ignorance. It is a structural feature of capitalist society. The market does operate as if commodities have objective values independent of any individual's will. The fetishism is real in the sense that the appearances it produces are functionally real. Prices really do move as if governed by forces independent of human choice. The most powerful implication is ideological. The categories of bourgeois economics, price, profit, wage, are not neutral descriptions of natural economic facts, but ideological representations that conceal the social relations of production. Critical analysis of these categories is simultaneously economic theory and ideology critique. The strongest objection, mounted by neoclassical economics and by analytical Marxist philosophers, is that the labor theory of value is empirically and theoretically problematic. Prices in capitalist economies do not, in fact, correspond to labor values in any direct way. Marx was aware of this, the transformation problem. How values transform into prices of production is addressed in Vol. 3, and his account remains incomplete. Contemporary analytical Marxists have argued that the normative claims about exploitation can be preserved without the labor theory of value. 6. Key TRMS and ideas. Gebrauchswert/Tauschwert German, use value/exchange value, the dual character of the commodity. Use value is the thing's practical usefulness. Exchange value is its ratio of exchange against other commodities. Marx argues that exchange value, at its foundation, reduces to abstract labor time. Mehrwert German, surplus value, the value created by workers beyond what is necessary to reproduce their labor power, the necessary labor time, the source of profit, interest, and rent, the mechanism of capitalist exploitation. Fetishism, German, commodity fetishism, the structural illusion in capitalist society by which social relations between producers appear as relations between things, commodities, money, capital. Entfremdung, German, alienation, the condition of the worker who is estranged from the product of their labor, from the labor process itself, from their species being, their capacity for free, conscious production, and from other people. Arbeitskraft, German, labor power, the worker's capacity to work, what is actually sold in the labor market, not labor itself. Crucial distinction: the worker sells the potential to labor for a period of time, not the actual product of their labor. Reserve army of labor, industrielle Reservarmee. the pool of unemployed and underemployed workers whose existence depresses wages and disciplines the employed workforce, produced by capital's substitution of machinery for labor. 7. Conclusion. Capital permanently changed the terms of economic and social analysis by showing that capitalism's categories, commodity, value, wage, profit, are not natural facts but historically specific social relations that can be understood, criticized, and transformed. Its influence on Lenin, Gramsci, the Frankfurt School, Adorno, Horkheimer, Louis Althusser, and the entire tradition of critical theory is foundational. Even among economists who reject the labor theory of value, capital's analyses of the business cycle, concentration of capital, and the political economy of the working day remain analytically powerful. The most unresolved question: is the labor theory of value economically defensible? And if not, can the normative critique of capitalism, the claim that surplus value represents exploitation, be preserved without it? The essential spirit of capital: what appears natural is historical. What appears inevitable is the product of specific social arrangements. And the first step toward changing the world is understanding how it actually works. Read it, and you will never look at a price tag in quite the same way.